hope you are excited about today's topic, content and language integrated learning, as I am. Here is our plan for today. We're going to do a warm-up activity with something called a KWL chart. How many of you have heard of a KWL chart before? No one. Oh, good. This will be new. Then I will give a lecture on CLIL, defining CLIL, talking about main theoretical as well as structural and practical components. I'll give you some time to reflect in groups on features of successful CLIL programs based on what you read this week. Then after that, we'll take a break, and when we come back, I will have activity stations for you where you can work in groups to read and to reflect on different practical activities that could be implemented in CLIL classrooms. And I will give you a rubric for evaluating those activities, and then we'll come back as a group. And then at the end, you'll have a chance to complete the KWL chart, and we'll do some other administrative tasks. Any questions at this point? Вопросы? Okay. I always forget how to say questions in Kazakh. Sekretai. Okay. All right. So the warm-up activity here is actually an activity that can be used in content and language integrated learning classrooms. And it's called and it comes from this book that I have called CLIL Activities by Dale and Tanner. And the purpose of this chart is to activate your prior knowledge, right? To get you ready to learn new content, as well as to acknowledge the fact that many of you, just based on reading your group assignments from last week, many of you already have some prior knowledge and experience with CLIL that we can draw on in the classroom as a resource. So this gives you an opportunity to further activate some of that knowledge. So the way it works is you make a chart for yourself, and I will not collect this time. This is just for you. You make a chart, and you write the name of the topic. Today's topic is CLIL. But if you were actually teaching a CLIL class, the topic might be cell division in biology, or network analysis in computer science, or something else. And there are 3 sections. The first is called know, that's the K, and that's where you write what you already know. Что вы уже знаете? About CLIL, yes. And then in the second column, it's called want, or W, and this is what you want to know, what questions you have. Что вы бы хотели узнать? Что вы хотели узнать о CLIL? And then this column is left blank. At the end of the lesson, or in a course, a longer course at the end of a unit, then you come back and fill in what you learned after today's lesson. So I will give you now, let's say, 5 minutes to fill in your categories. And teachers, if you are watching this video, you can also take 5 minutes. Сделайте вот это первый и второй columns. Колонки. I love that word. Колонки. Себя. No, this is individual, right? Everyone has their own set of knowledge. But thank you for asking that question. No, this is individual work. Do you need me to set a timer? No. Okay. are finished. Two more minutes, guys. Column. So I'm going to go ahead and start the lecture. And remember, as I touch upon something that's on your already know list, if you want to add some comment, or if it's on your want to know list and you have some question, please just raise your hand. So first of all, how do we define CLIL? It's the teaching of both content and language in an additional language. So something beyond at least one of the native languages. But there are two important qualifications here. One is that you're learning in a foreign language while favoring L1 development. So what do you think? Is this additive or subtractive bilingualism? Additive, yeah. At least as the model. But also Coyle and her colleagues point out that sometimes the additional language is often a foreign language, but it can also be a second language in the country or a heritage language. And we're going to talk more about heritage languages next week. But for now, the short definition is the language of one's ethnic identity. So, for example, Uyghur or Korean or German or Ukrainian in Kazakhstan, or Spanish in the United States for some people, or Punjabi in India. And again, we'll learn more about that next week, but those can also be taught in a CLIL approach. It's important to emphasize, because a lot of the emphasis worldwide, or at least in Europe, is on using CLIL to teach English. But it's not only for English. In fact, when I didn't put the slide up, but when I was preparing my dissertation and I wrote a part of my literature review about CLIL, and I reviewed some of the statistics from Eurydice, which reports on different programs, and I found only about half the programs in Europe, in the European Union, that are identified as CLIL are English. So the others are a different foreign language. So for example, in Malta, everyone is learning both Maltese and English in schools, but all of those programs are called CLIL. In Luxembourg, you can be learning Luxembourgish, which is a language that has varied from German or French, depending on what your L1 is. In Belgium, there are certain parts of Belgium where you can be learning German or French through CLIL approaches. In Spain, it gets very interesting. You have Spanish as a de facto L1. Then you have a second language, either Basque or Catalan or Galician or Valencia, depending on the region of Spain. And then the third language for CLIL would be the foreign language, either English or French or German or Portuguese, for example. So it's not only for English. And I would now add that in Kazakhstan, Kazakh can be considered an L2 that is taught through CLIL. And actually, there are students here who have done master's theses or are writing master's theses now on teaching Kazakh to Russian-dominant Kazakhstanis using the CLIL approach. Do you agree with that? Yes, okay. Yeah. So now we come to curriculum models of CLIL, and as I've been saying for the past 2 weeks, right, there are a number of different ways to realize models of bilingual and multilingual education. So some of the characteristics and formats that have come up in the literature. So what Mejisto point out, and which group was it last week that had that beautiful list of 3 models of the relationship between content and language teachers? I think no, it wasn't It was a triangle in the list, yes. Was that your group? So I'll say a few words here about content teachers teaching some language and language teachers including subject material in their courses. That's that's the integrated part, is that people who specialize in content are teaching a little bit of language, and people who specialize in language are including a little bit of the content in their language subject classes. But Ayana, can you say a few words about the different types of teachers you identified in Kazakhstan?
There are 3 types, if I'm not mistaken. I don't remember actually, but the first type are the teachers of the English language who are proficient in English, but they do not know and not so proficient in the science subjects. The second type are the teachers who are really proficient in the science subject, but they don't know English. So it should be a kind of training for them. And the last type are the teachers who are very proficient in English and they know something about the subject, but the methodology of teaching is lacking.
So maybe our Bolashok graduates who come back proficient in English and content but haven't been trained as teachers. Yes, yes. And usually at least one of these 3 types, usually there's at least one of these 3 types teaching content and language in a school at a time, at least in Kazakhstan. And it's not an ideal situation, but it's often the reality. Any other comments on that? Okay. But how effective they can be can also depend on the type of model that they're put in. For very young children, there can be what are called language showers, where there's just very brief exposure to language, often through some kind of game or song, or extracurricular camps, right, where people go for a summer. And those are usually taught by the more proficient speakers and people more proficient in pedagogy. Or it can go on the continuum to full immersion programs. And the more teaching that's required and the more places it's required, the more you're going to run in, I think, into these situations where people are less trained. Now, CLIL, and I should mention these 2 books. Mehisto has a book called Uncovering CLIL. I think everyone who knows CLIL also knows Peter Mehisto. He's Estonian, Finnish, British, but often comes through Kazakhstan to do trainings on CLIL. And then Do Coyle and her colleagues have this book on CLIL. So if you're writing about CLIL for your final paper, I have these resources for you. Anyway, Coyle says she divides the teaching into 2 types, partial and extensive. And we've heard variations of these terms before, yes? With immersion last week. So partial instruction means that immersion or CLIL is only happening in certain subjects and there's limited exposure. And I think certainly in the trilingual education model, we can talk about history of Kazakh or geography as examples of that. Whereas more extensive instruction, again, if we're talking about a single target language, is that the target language is used almost exclusively. And I do like to emphasize the phrase almost exclusively because we like to allow space for the L1 or L2. And also because they say, they still qualify it by saying that it's 50% or more of the time. Again, there's often this image of immersion or CLIL that it's all one language all the time. Or, in this context, 3 languages at certain times and no other languages at any other times. But again, it's a continuum. There's a range of ways to implement it. Does that make sense? Any questions or comments? No. Okay. In this second type in particular, the goal, Coyle says, is high content mastery and language proficiency. And she adds oftentimes it's connected with particular certificates So maybe at NIS, you're trying to pass the Cambridge exams. When I looked at this at the university in Ukraine, the students were trying to pass the first certificate of English test from Cambridge. Although we can argue about the extent to which they were focused on content, but they were getting a degree in economics. So they were, in principle, focused on learning economic theory. In terms of curriculum models, and again, this comes from the CLIL book, at the preschool level. Can you imagine? There is CLIL at the preschool level. Yeah, you know about this?
Here in Astana, I know some schools. They are preschools, like our children, Kazakh children, immersed with this program.
Yeah.
Preschool education, they have English instructors.
Okay.
Yeah, so they're learning not only English as a game, of course. Yeah, and story tales, often some activities with English, and they are like prepared for the CLIL from the 5 years.
And do your children attend such a school?
So we are going to.
Going to, okay. It's in the plan. I don't remember how old your children are. And how many hours a day are they in this program?
One, maybe they start from 30 minutes to 1 hour every day.
Yeah. So that might be like the language shower model that Mehisto was talking about. And how long are they in preschool altogether per day?
5 days.
Per day.
So are they only going for that 30 minutes to an hour for English lessons, or do they have, is that 30 minutes to an hour part of a longer preschool day?
Part of a longer.
Okay. So what percentage of the day is that 30 minutes to an hour?
It's not so long for one day. Maybe it's like 20%.
20%, okay. You're right. So just very limited exposure.
For 5 years, and it's more 6, 7, and maybe secondary before they go to school.
Which makes sense. I mean, because just children's attention span, anything more than 30 minutes to an hour in a foreign language starts to become difficult, I imagine. So, but that sounds fantastic. We should do a field trip there at some point. You can ask Professor Nettie next year. So moving on then to primary, and I want to emphasize here that COIL defines primary as ages 5 to 12. I know in the Kazakhstani system, children start primary school at age 6 or 7. And the divide between primary and secondary may be a little bit different, but COIL's definition here is ages 5 to 12. So in the US context, that would be kindergarten until middle school, until 5th or 6th grade. Here, it would probably be until 6th grade, because at 7th grade is when the NIS schools start and the transition, I think, starts to happen. I see nodding heads that you agree. Okay.
Actually, it's till the end of the 4th grade.
Till the end of the 4th grade?
Yes, till the end of the 4th grade. And starting in the 5th grade is secondary school.
5th grade is already secondary school.
Yes, till the 9th grade.
Okay.
And then high school.
I mean, that fits the models of some parts of the United States where middle school starts at grade 5, and you have a 5 to 8 grade middle school and then a 9 to 12 grade high school. That still feels young to me, but maybe because I'm not a 5th grader anymore. But thank you, Fariza, for clarifying that. So it's ironic to talk about this now. But so at those primary grades, what COIL says is mostly it's preparatory. And again, we can even start to call this preparatory immersion, as we did last week, that they focus on confidence building, right? Reducing students' anxiety about learning in a foreign language. That's very important. Starting to introduce the key concepts so that when they get into a fuller immersion program, they're not surprised by it. They go, oh, they can activate their prior knowledge. Starting to develop learner autonomy. How do you... Self-learning, exactly, right? Not just the teacher coming in and telling you everything, but giving you opportunities to interact with information and develop knowledge yourself. So at the secondary level, this is where you start to move away from the psychological focus into more of the program structure itself. So they talk about, I should say, it's not just Coyle. Coyle and her colleagues talk about the dual school approach, which I think is rarer, where you have two different schools that are sharing knowledge, teachers and students sharing knowledge across schools. Maybe NIS and the school that is being translated to would be considered that. At the tertiary level, no, I wouldn't even consider that a good model. But that is one model. Then bilingual, or we could add here the trilingual model that's really developing, one or more language at the same time through these approaches. Then they talk about interdisciplinary, or learning across the curriculum. Who are my former NIS teachers here? What are some examples of subjects that are considered learning across the curriculum subjects at NIS? Mathematics? Biology? Okay, maybe I'll ask another question. How are you understanding the term across the curriculum? But across the curriculum would mean that every teacher should be teaching a little bit of that. Like, I thought environmental science or global perspectives were across the curriculum subjects. That every teacher, whether you're teaching biology or chemistry or mathematics, should also be doing a little bit of environmental studies teaching and a little bit of global perspectives. Do I have that wrong in the NIS context? Okay. I thought I saw that in a curriculum document. But the point is that if you have teaching happening or modules happening across the curriculum, then teachers from different subjects are working together on common goals. So for example, like here, I'm actually working with other professors to try and make CLIL an across the curriculum topic, and something that's covered in this class, the foundations class, and in methods classes, and in language acquisition, right? So that you're learning about it in different ways from different disciplinary perspectives, but that you start to see connections among those topics. And you'll see later that connections are a key part of CLIL, and I see a Sim shaking her head, yes. All right. Language projects, I won't focus on this one because this is not the dominant model, but this word here is vocational. So I guess robotny, right? So very specific CLIL development for very specific purposes. So for example, in the United States, a colleague of mine at the School of Medicine was telling me there are special courses on Spanish for nurses, right? So that nurses can learn to communicate, nurses, medsestri, can communicate in Spanish, right? So that might be a vocational element of CLIL. If they're learning about medicine and about nursing and about patient-nurse communication in Spanish, or mostly in Spanish with a little bit of English. There is also a tertiary level, but I couldn't get the smart art to work because, as you see, I'm not technologically savvy. But the main points I'll make about tertiary or university level education is that it can either be plurilingual, so just focused on a little bit on developing skills in different languages, or they also talk about an adjunct model in the sense of content and language teachers working together to teach subjects, which I think can also happen at the secondary level and is happening, as someone else pointed out last week, is happening already at NIS schools where you have team teaching of content and language teachers. Any questions or comments about this? Okay. I mean, the other thing I'll say about tertiary before we move on is part of the reason that I left that off is that usually tertiary education in CLIL means English as a medium of instruction. So usually that research is going to fall under EMI rather than CLIL. But there are some university programs that are set up as CLIL programs. All right. So now, very briefly, I'd like you to take a minute, think, pair, share. We've done think, pair, share before. You think, and then you talk to a partner, although usually you just go ahead and start talking, which is fine. But the question I have for you is based on what you've heard so far and what you've read, to you, is CLIL different from immersion? Okay, so take a minute to think, and again, and share with a partner. And teachers watching the video, you can, this question is for my students because last week we talked about immersion. Потому что в этом курсе это очень важно понимать концепции и как они отличаются или если они одинаковы. All right, you guys are, you have resolved the problem. And see, now I'm translating from Russian into English. You've decided. What have you decided? Are they the same or are they different or does it depend? Huh? Different opinions, okay. I'll poll the class in a minute. Okay, can we come back as a whole class now? I know, you're too motivated, you're too excited, you can't stop, so. And I deeply appreciate that, but we do have to keep the lesson moving. So I'm sorry I did not set up a poll everywhere poll to record the results electronically. So we have to do this the old-fashioned way. How many of you said that CLIL and immersion are the same? Raise your hand. Oh, just one. Oh, okay. How many of you said they're different, completely different? Okay. Wow, let me rephrase that. See, I should have pilot tested this survey before I started it. How many of you said that CLIL and immersion are different? Just different. Just different. So, how many of you said you're not sure or it depends? It depends. All right. Well, there are some similarities, but there are also some differences. So let's hear from you. What are some of the differences that you identified, or some of the conditions, if it depends? Sagita?
For conditions, we can say that, for example, immersion is more of American and Canadian. When in Canada, both French and English have the status of the societal languages. Yeah. They have high status. But in CLIL, it's sometimes foreign language. It's not as represented in the society. So it's kind of harder, less extramural exposure.
But remember that Canadian immersion and American immersion can be different depending on the model. And as we saw here, that even in Europe, CLIL is not always foreign language. But I think you're right that the majority of time it has that perception. Lanera, and then Sharapat?
I believe in immersion schools that only one language is concerned, like you can immerse in only one language, whereas in CLIL, 2 or even 3 languages can be involved.
Actually, that's the best explanation I've heard all day, or all week. I mean, in readings, yes, gold star for you. And I don't normally give gold stars, but that was fantastic. Sharapat, and then Dana?
I think CLIL is a kind of educational approach. It's a language teaching approach, we consider as. But immersion program is a kind of education system.
Another gold star. You guys are ready to take my job. Fantastic. Dana?
Yeah, and my point would add Sharpat's in terms that the CLIL is more about language learning, content, content is language learning, and the immersion can be concerned with the content itself. Okay. Like the more emphasis is put to the content, not the language.
I think based on what you've read and other writings about CLIL, you are correct. But I have another reading that I just posted online, and I'm sorry I didn't post it earlier, but it is available, Senos, Genesee, and Gorder, who critique that and who say that especially the Canadian immersion programs do have a language emphasis as well. But otherwise, I see your point. Sagita?
For CLIL as well, it's seen as a linear model where both ends are the content and language learning, and it can be on the range anywhere between.
Yes.
Yeah, continuum. Yeah.
It's on a continuum, yes. So, but immersion is simply more focused on the content end. I like that explanation of it. Even though it's very similar, I guess the metaphor works for me. All right. Any other comments on this? Okay, if not, then I do want to move on, and I hope my audience will stay with me through the 4 C's, because I think these are the most important parts of CLIL, and then we'll come back to the other activity after the break. So if you recall, from the readings, were these in the readings this week, the 4 C's? Yes. Okay. I should remember what I've assigned, but there was so much rich information in the readings. But for our friends watching with us, right, these are the 4 main elements of the CLIL approach. And the first one is content. And again, as we heard already, it's content-driven, but you want to make sure students have knowledge of the forms in order to understand the content. And I put some examples here of past tense and hypotheticals. For example, past tense for reporting experiments in science classes, or hypotheticals if you're talking about history. What would have happened in America if Abraham Lincoln had not been shot? These are the kinds of issues people can raise. The second one is communication. And it's both learning to use language and using language to learn. This is what Mehisto says. Not just vocabulary. I think a lot of the emphasis that I hear about, especially in the Kazakhstani context, is on vocabulary. And of course, vocabulary is important. Even in our classes here, right? How much time are we spending trying to really understand a word like immersion or CLIL? But also when you're learning content, it's not only about vocabulary, but about functions of that, functions of language in general and genres. I think someone last week said there's a difference in technical writing versus research writing or reflective writing, right? These are different genres of writing, regardless of what the content is, but sometimes directly related to the content, that there's a specific function of language for that content activity. There's a way to write about a lab experiment versus an experiment with a language learning procedure in education. There may be some similarities, there's similar genre, and the language that's used there has similar functions, but there may be slight nuances. So it's not just vocabulary alone. This is an important point that comes from deeper theories of language learning about taking content input to produce output. Swain, who's a Canadian researcher, calls this the pushed output hypothesis, that if you want to learn language, the best way to do it is to force yourself to use the language. So if I'm just lecturing to you, or someone is just lecturing to you about biology or physics in the target language, but you are not asked then to produce that language, right? You're not going to learn. Like Sagita today really learned the word continuum because she was in a situation where she had to produce it. And I too, learning Russian, not in class and out of class. When the lock broke in my door, I had to learn the words for key and lock. So that's a different kind of learning outcome that we don't want our students to have. We want to have a more controlled learning outcome that's not a fire hazard. But that's what I mean by pushed output, producing output. And the more they can produce output, the more they'll be able to communicate with others in the future. The third one is cognition. And a lot of times this gets talked about, I know Professor Rita loves to talk about higher order thinking. Coyle and Mejisto and their colleagues have some nice vocabulary words about it, like perceiving, recognizing, judging. I think we're back to the Myers-Briggs test. Did we talk about that, or was that my other class? Anyway, not important. Reasoning, conceiving, right? Creating ideas. Imagining. Any other higher order thinking verbs in English you want to add? Evaluating. Creating. Whoa, one at a time. Evaluating. Analyzing. Creating. Actually, let me write these down. So we had evaluating, creating, analyzing, synthesizing. But what do you guys think about the word criticizing? Yeah, so this is an important language learning moment. Because being critical reflection or critical analysis is going beyond what's there to analyze and to reflect. But criticizing is something different. Criticizing is saying, oh, this is no good, oh, it's stupid, you're stupid, everything that we don't want to do as teachers. And linguistically, they seem very similar. But well, I won't use the political metaphor, but I'll let you critically reflect on that yourself. Yes, Asyam. Ah, metacognition. Thinking. Can you give an example of an activity in a CLIL class?
Activity in the CLIL class?
That requires some metacognition?
Explain my words, how I understand the metacognition.
Okay.
So it is when you are doing something, for example, writing the research work, so that you are doing step back and thinking about how do you think.
Yes,
What
the process.
method you put.
Mm-hmm.
And then return back, analyze the process, and then use it for the critical reflection.
Brilliant, brilliant. I want you as my biology teacher. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Did you have something to add, Igarim? Okay. Anyone else have anything to add? Okay. So, and the last one is culture or community. And I love this quote from Michael Byram, who is originally from England, who was the advisor of our former Vice Dean, Lynn Palmenter. So I guess he's your academic great-grandfather. He said, learning about otherness can help us understand ourselves. So as you take these global perspective classes, as you learn in science and technology and math classes about other cultures or other communities, right? Like the scientific community, like the English as a medium of instruction community, as the multilingual education community. As you learn about these other communities and other contexts, you have a chance to critically reflect on your own. And that's important to emphasize for students. And the last point, and then I'll let our friends say goodbye, is that even though I have listed them separately, because my mind works in lists, not in pictures, the diagram, as you recall, shows that they are integrated because they are, in fact, integrated. It shouldn't be that you're teaching one at a time, but like the continuum of biliteracy, your teaching in CLIL should touch on one or more of these points. Thank you.
Thank you guys so much.